lady, first looking round to assure herself there was nobody within hearing, and then looking down upon the floor. "I am very much afraid, sir, that his conscience is troubled by his not being related to, or even married to, a very young lady." "Mrs. Lupin," said Mr. Pecksniff, holding up his hand with something in his manner as nearly approaching to severity as any expression of his, mild being that he was, could ever do. "Person? Young person?" "A very young person," said Mrs. Lupin, curtsying and blushing. "Beg your pardon, sir, but I've been so hurried tonight that I don't know what I say. Who is with him now?" "Who is with him now?" ruminated Mr. Pecksniff, warming his back as he had warmed his hands, as if it were a widow's back, or an orphan's back, or an enemy's back, or a back that any less excellent man would have suffered to be cold. "Oh, dear me, dear me." "At the same time, I am bound to say, and I do say with all my heart," observed the hostess earnestly, "that her looks and manner almost disarm suspicion." "Your suspicion, Mrs. Lupin," said Mr. Pecksniff gravely, "is very natural." Touching which remark, let it be written down to their confusion that the enemies of this worthy man unblushingly maintained that he always said of what was very bad that if it was very natural, and that he unconsciously betrayed his own nature in doing so. "Your suspicion, Mrs. Lupin," he repeated, "is very natural, and I have no doubt correct. I will wait upon these travellers." With that he took off his greatcoat, and having run his fingers through his hair, thrust one hand gently in the bosom of his waistcoat, and meekly signed her to lead the way. "Shall I knock?" asked Mrs. Lupin when they reached the chamber door. "No," said Mr. Pecksniff. "Enter if you please." They went in on tiptoe, or rather the hostess took that precaution. Mr. Pecksniff always walked so. The old gentleman was still asleep, and his young companion still sat reading by the fire. "I'm afraid," said Mr. Pecksniff, pausing at the door and giving his head a melancholy roll, "I'm afraid that this looks after. I'm afraid, Mrs. Lupin, do you know, that this looks very after." As he finished this whisper, he advanced before the hostess, and at the same time the young lady, hearing his footsteps, rose. Mr. Pecksniff glanced at the volume she held, and whispered to Mrs. Lupin again, if possible with increased despondency. "Yes, ma'am," he said, "it's a good book. I was fearful of that beforehand. I am apprehensive that this is a very deep thing indeed." "What gentleman is this?" inquired the object of his virtuous doubts. "Hush! Don't trouble yourself, ma'am," said Mr. Pecksniff, as the landlady was about to answer. This young, in spite of himself, he hesitated, when person rose to his lips, and substituted another word. "This young stranger, Mrs. Lupin, will excuse me for replying briefly that I reside in this village. It may be in an influential manner, however undeserved, and that I have been summoned here by you. I am here, as I am everywhere, I hope, in sympathy for the sick and sorry." With these impressive words, Mr. Pecksniff passed over to the bedside, where, after patting the counterpane once or twice in a very solemn manner, as if by that means he gained a clear insight into the patient's disorder, he took his seat in a large armchair, and in an attitude of some thoughtfulness and much comfort, waited for his waking. Whatever objection the young lady urged to Mrs. Lupin went no further, for nothing more was said to Mr. Pecksniff, and Mr. Pecksniff said nothing more to anybody else. Full half an hour elapsed before the old man stirred, but at length he turned himself in bed, and though not yet awake, gave tokens that his sleep was drawing to an end. By little and little he removed the bedclothes from about his head, and turned still more towards the side where Mr. Pecksniff sat. In course of time his eyes opened, and he lay for a few moments, as people newly roused sometimes will, gazing indolently at his visitor, without any distinct consciousness of his presence. There was nothing remarkable in these proceedings, except the influence they worked upon Mr. Pecksniff, which could hardly have been surpassed by the most marvellous of natural phenomena. Gradually his hands became tightly clasped upon the elbows of the chair. His eyes dilated with surprise, his mouth opened, his hair stood more erect upon his forehead than its custom was, until at length, when the old man rose in bed and stared at him with scarcely less emotion than he showed himself, Pecksniff's doubts were all resolved. Exclaimed aloud, "You are Martin Chuzzlewit." His consternation of surprise was so genuine that the old man, with all the disposition that he clearly entertained to believe it assumed, was convinced of its reality. "I am Martin Chuzzlewit," he said bitterly, "and Martin Chuzzlewit wishes you had been hanged before he'd come here to disturb him in his sleep. Why, I dreamed of this fellow," he said, lying down again and turning away his face, "before I knew that he was near me." "My good cousin," said Mr. Pecksniff. "There, his very first words," cried the old man, shaking his grey head to and fro upon the pillow, and throwing up his hands. "In his very first words he asserts his relationship. I knew he would. They all do it, near or distant, blood or water, it's all one. Yeah, what a calendar of deceit and lying, false witnessing. The sound of any word of kindred opens before me." "Pray do not be hasty, Mr. Chuzzlewit," said Pecksniff, in a tone that was at once the sublimest degree of compassionate and dispassionate, for he had by this time recovered from his surprise and was in full possession of his virtuous self. "You will regret being hasty. I know you will." "You know," said Martin contemptuously. "Yes," retorted Mr. Pecksniff. Aye, Mr. Chuzzlewit. "And don't imagine that I mean to court or flatter you, for nothing is further from my intention. Neither, sir, need you entertain the least misgiving that I shall repeat that obnoxious word which has given you much offence already. Why should I? What do I expect or want from you? There is nothing in your possession that I know of, Mr. Chuzzlewit, which is much to be coveted for the happiness it brings you." "That's true enough," muttered the old man. "Apart from that consideration," said Mr. Pecksniff, watchful of the effect he made, "it must be plain to you, I am sure, by this time, that if I had wished to insinuate myself into your good opinion, I should have been of all things careful not to address you as a relative, knowing your humour, and being quite certain beforehand that I could not have a worse letter of recommendation." Martin made not any verbal answer, but he as clearly implied, though only by a motion of his legs beneath the bedclothes, there was reason in this, and that he could not dispute it, as if he had said as much in good set terms. "No," said Mr. Pecksniff, keeping his hand in his waistcoat, as though he were already on the shortest notice to produce his heart on Martin Chuzzlewit's inspection. "I came here to offer my services to a stranger. I make no offer of them to you, because I know you would distrust me if I did. But lying on that bed, sir, I regard you as a stranger, and I have just that amount of interest in you which I hope I should feel in any stranger, circumstances you are. Beyond that, I am quite as indifferent to you, Mr. Chuzzlewit, as you are to me." Having said which, Mr. Pecksniff threw himself back in the easy chair, so radiant with ingenuous honesty that Mrs. Lupin almost wondered not to see a stained glass glory, such as the saint wore in the church, shining about his head. A long pause succeeded. The old man, with increased restlessness, changed his posture several times. Mrs. Lupin and the young lady gazed in silence at the counterpane. Mr. Pecksniff toyed abstractedly with his eyeglass and kept his eyes shut that he might ruminate the better. He said at last, opening them suddenly and looking towards the bed. "I beg your pardon. I thought you spoke." "Mrs. Lupin," he continued, slowly rising, "I am not aware that I can be of any service to you here. The gentleman is better, and you are as good a nurse as he can have, eh?" This last note of interrogation bore reference to another change of posture on the old man's part, which brought his face towards Mr. Pecksniff for the first time since he had turned away from him. "If you desire to speak to me before I go, sir," continued that gentleman after another pause, "you may command my leisure, but I must stipulate, in justice to myself, that you do so as to a stranger, strictly as to a stranger." Now, if Mr. Pecksniff knew, from anything Martin Chuzzlewit had expressed in gestures, that he wanted to speak to him, he could only have found it out on some such principle as prevails in melodramas, and in virtue of which the elderly farmer with a comic son always knows what the dumb girl means when she takes refuge in his garden, and relates her personal memoirs in an incomprehensible pantomime. But without stopping to make any inquiry on this point, Martin Chuzzlewit signed for his young companion to withdraw, which she immediately did, along with the landlady, leaving him and Mr. Pecksniff alone together. For some time they looked at each other in silence, or rather the old man looked at Mr. Pecksniff, and Mr. Pecksniff, again closing his eyes on all outward objects, took an inward survey of his own breast. That it amply repaid him for his trouble and afforded a delicious and enchanting prospect was clear from the expression on his face. "Do you wish me to speak to you as a total stranger?" said the old man. "Do you?" Mr. Pecksniff replied by a shrug of his shoulders and an apparent turning round of his eyes in their sockets.